I have set this album up for a sequel just because the last line is like about how babies sing new songs.
Yeah.
It asks a question that I'm not ready to answer yet, which is what song would a completely free person sing who has never known captivity?
Oh my God. Welcome to We Flew Off the Page. I'm Muhammad 7. I'm here to do my very favorite thing in the world. Talk to great songwriters about how they do what they do. And each episode will dive into the little details of two of my guests' songs, which I will play for you. The songwriter has chosen one of their songs, and I have agonized over and selected the other from their catalog of wonderful music. Today's episode is brought to you by strawberries. Red and plump, and the only fruit that wears its seeds on the outside, strawberries reflect all our human complexities back to us. They're not considered true berries because, seeds on the outside. They're a member of the rose family, which explains their magical aroma. Each strawberry has around 200 seeds, and each seed is considered its own separate fruit. Some believe them to have medicinal properties, and these proud perennials are tenacious. They come back year after year and never give up. Well, if you can't find a metaphor for yourself somewhere in there, then God help you. Thank you, Noble Strawberry, for sponsoring today's episode of We Flew Off the Page. Speaking of today's show, as you know, I myself am a working songwriter. Remember when to have an artist's music, we shelled out $15 or $20 for their album? Well, some of us still do that, but for most of us, $10 a month gets you every album ever made through streaming. How does that math work? Well, it doesn't. It means that all music is now basically free, and independent artists are having to find other ways to make a living. For many of us, that includes crowdfunding in an odd and wonderful land called Patreon. If you like what I do on the podcast and on records, you can consider supporting my work for as little as $1 a month. And I put a lot of effort into making the bonus content I put on there exciting. You can find my Patreon at patreon.com/Muhammad7, which is in the show notes. And my guest today also has a wonderful Patreon you should check out. I will put that in the show notes too. We're still a relatively new podcast here at We Flew Off the Page. It'll help a lot if you can review the show on Apple Podcasts. And if you do, I might read your review at the end of the show. And lastly, you could share We Flew Off the Page with a friend and win my undying gratitude. Now, who doesn't want that? All right, announcement horns, please. Today, I have the great pleasure of talking to the inimitable Lizzie No. Now, I'll be honest, oftentimes I introduce people by reading the bio they've posted on their website, but I can't do that in good conscience in the case of Lizzie No. Because in order to try to capture their depth and complexity, I had to draw from many sources. Lizzie is a working, touring, genre-agnostic songwriter whose feverish tour schedule crosses the US and Europe this year. I suggest you check it out on their website. It's pretty fun to see all the ground they're covering. Lizzie's the co-host of the Basic Folk podcast alongside their best friend Cindy Howes. And if you haven't, you should really check out the Basic Folk podcast. It's fun and thoughtful, and almost guaranteed you'll find an episode with one of your favorite artists. Lizzie serves as president of the board of directors of the organization Abortion Care Tennessee. Rolling Stone recently included Lizzie in their prestigious Future of Music 2025 list. And Lizzie's newest album, Halfsies, is not just a sort of concept album, it's more like a four concepts album. It follows the character Miss Freedomland, a reference to the New York City beauty pageant Lizzie's mother won as a child. But the character seems to be a hybrid of Lizzie and their mother, and maybe every woman, as they navigate life through the hostile American waters of racism and sexism and homophobia in particular. Every album of music has a flow. This album has a narrative flow where Miss Freedomland starts out in one place and ends up a lifetime away from their origin story by the end. Both of the songs we'll discuss on today's episode are from this album, and it's titled Halfsies. But I will not have Lizzie lay out the beautiful narrative arc of the album because she's already done that in an interview on episode 150 of the Basic Folk podcast, which again she co-hosts with bestie Cindy Howes. Lizzie sits on the other side of the mic as the guest of that episode. It's a really special conversation between two close friends. where they comb through the album song by song. I'll link to that as well in the show notes. So I recommend you go have a listen. I'll end with a quote from Lizzie's website bio. You could say that Lizzie No writes protest songs, in that as a queer black woman, her entire existence is a living, breathing, singing protest against a genre and a country that, on their best days, are reluctant to reckon with the very foundations upon which they were built. The erasure of black artists is central to the myth of country music, what it means, what it stands for, where it comes from. And so, simply by standing on stage and singing, whether it be in theaters across the country with the Black Opry, or at queer line dancing nights with the Lavender Country Tour, Lizzie No is staging a kind of protest. Okay, I couldn't figure out where to squeeze in throughout all of that Lizzie is also both a harp and guitar player. Not talking about harmonica, I mean the stringed harp. Lizzie No, welcome to We Flew Off the Page.
Oh my goodness. I am so happy to be speaking with you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I don't think that I've ever been introduced so beautifully in an interview. It was really nice to hear Casey Anderson's notes about me read in your beautiful speaking voice. Oh. He did such a good job with my bio. The other thing I wanted to note, I don't know if we're ready to really go in there, is that I almost laughed out loud when you were like, I'm not going to have Lizzie talk about, every step-by-step narrative move of this album because it's already been done elsewhere. And that is the idea of we're going to value this person's time, and I encourage you to do the same, is so radical and feminist and good. And I am just so glad to be here on We Flew Off the Page. Hi.
Hello. I'd like to start today with a topic that I've never discussed before on the show. And it's the fact that you and I both have a stage name. Mm-hmm. We each have stage names, both of which are born out of oppression and revolution. Mm-hmm. I'll say also that I don't like to talk about the fact that Muhammad 7 is a stage name. Probably this is the first that many listeners are hearing of this. And in fact, I just played a show on Saturday, and a really nice couple who, gushed about the set wanted to know where I came up with the name Muhammad 7, and I just told them it was my real name. And I think I do that because the real reason is complicated. And if you ask me about it in passing, I can't possibly explain it to you in a way that's good for me. But I am actually interested to discuss it here with you, if that's a conversation you're interested in having.
Well, I get a little knot in my tummy when people ask me about where the name Lizzie No came from. And it's kind of the same feeling that I get when someone asks me what a song means, because there are so many different answers, all of which are true and none of which are enough. It's a name that just came up. The answer is boring. I was getting my photo taken for my very first Facebook page as an artist, and my photographer friend asked me, "Oh, what's your name going to be when you release this music?" And I just said Lizzie No, and that was it. So I can retroactively apply all different kinds of logic about how when you start a project that's going to be a solo project, you have to push out a lot of other things. You have to say no to you have to say no to the music that you might have made before. You have to say no to other people's expectations. You have to be ready to say no to opportunities that aren't right for you. You have to say no to being, swayed. Mm-hmm. You have to say yes to your intuition. It's there's so many things that can be true about the name, but really it just came from my gut and stuck.
Wow, it's so cool that it came in a moment where somehow you just knew. I mean, it's also interesting. This may or may not be important, but the the word know and the fact that you knew. It's like
Mm-hmm.
there's the other correlation of the word is to know. There's no in
Yes.
the so it's like two interesting
The
meanings.
interesting thing, the way I felt, I feel like I felt more like a child saying no, and that's kind of the Miss Freedom Land connection. Like, often the first word that a child will say when they are learning that they have a definition outside of their mother is no. Like, babies just repeat the word no, no, no. And that's them saying, it's different from when they say dada. Because
Mm-hmm.
dada is like, oh, there's another person. No is a baby's way of saying, I am someone.
Mm.
Um, and so it's often the beginning of a self definition. Um, in the same way that Miss Freedom Land is like a title that comes from this experience of childhood and knowing that like you want to be free, if that makes sense.
It does. It's super lovely. Um, I think I'll move on unless you wanted to ask me anything about my end of it. Which
Okay,
you
I
don't.
want to, but I also know that you don't. Well, what do you want to say about it? Because there are a lot of tricky questions about people's stage names.
Yeah.
Um,
I just want to clarify.
what
I was saying I don't like to talk about it, but in this particular case,
You're ready
I
to
would
talk
be
about it?
I'd be
Okay.
interested to talk to you about it. So I'm sort
Okay,
of giving you the
okay.
permission that I
Yes.
mostly refuse everybody else.
Okay. Okay, so this is an opportunity. Um, who is Muhammad 7?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, like so many of us, we're artists, we're creators. Ultimately, at some level, I don't know. This might not be right, but I almost feel like at the bottom of it, at the foundation of it, I'm an entertainer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, otherwise, my the performance and it being entertaining, it's not the same thing as it being pleasant necessarily. You know,
Correct.
like the folks that asked me about the name, they this is at a winery nearby. They cried during the set. It's like
Mm-hmm.
that's I think both a pleasant and an unpleasant experience, right? The
Mm-hmm.
catharsis involved in something
Right.
like that. And so, but anyway, so and a little bit of the backstory to how I took on the name was on a tour around 2010 was my first tour actually with
Mm-hmm.
a friend, previous guest on the show, Chris Sand, the Sandman, who was a more successful touring artist and took me along with him for my first tour. Um, and we ran into racism in all of these different ways along the tour, and he's one of my closest friends and was a good friend to me in the face of all of that. But in the end, it started to seem clear that using my own name meant fewer bookings. It meant,
Mm-hmm.
in particular, it meant people were confused. My name, I have an Iranian name, and it meant my particular Iranian name, people didn't know where to place me, and somehow that made them more uncomfortable than if they knew where to place me, as an Iranian, that they felt uncomfortable. If you're following what I'm saying, it wasn't super clear.
Oh,
But
yes.
so I had kind of had two options in a name change, either to take on a name that assimilated or to double
Mm-hmm.
down. And anybody who knows me will not be surprised that I was never going to assimilate. Like, not just because because to me assimilation is maybe the most horrible thing that can happen to a person. I mean,
Yes.
among anyway. Go ahead,
Can I say back to you what I think you're getting at and make sure I
please.
haven't misinterpreted?
No,
So,
please.
what you're saying is you could have chosen a name that was maybe abstract
Hmm.
and read less Iranian.
Yeah, glass
So
house.
that, right. The beams of light or
Right,
whatever.
exactly.
But there is a power in actually going in a direction that makes you more obviously other so that you have more room to move around as an artist, like even if it means you're going to be at a distance from some people. Is that
It's exactly it. And Muhammad
It's like
was
it's actually worse when people don't quite know what to do with you than if they're like, oh, that's different.
Yeah, I mean, and also just professionally worse.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, it's like people are oddly less unlike to book me as Muhammad
Mm.
because it's clear what they understand who they're dealing with. At some, I mean, they have no idea who they're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with, but they at least can put me in a category
Oh my
that doesn't
gosh.
make them uncomfortable, right? And Muhammad was an obvious choice because I spent all those years I spent in restaurants. Some of that I spent waiting tables, and when I introduced myself, I have a name that sounds like some other things, and
Mm-hmm.
people like to make jokes about it. So I got tired of that, obviously, fast
People are
enough.
the worst.
Yeah.
Can you imagine meeting someone and they introduce you the name their parents lovingly gave them, and you're
Right.
just like, haha,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's been the story of my whole life is people needing to comment about my name. And so I started as a waiter introducing myself as Muhammad, which is my grandfather's name.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody got shit to say when you tell them your name
No,
was
it's a
Muhammad.
beautiful name and it's instantly recognizable.
Yeah, and people are scared of it is the other,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at least the people who
Yes.
want to make fun of my real name. So yeah, so anyway, that's where Muhammad came from.
Oh, it
Seven
is
is,
definitely better to be feared than teased.
there's no question.
Absolutely. I love that for you. Thank you for explaining.
Yeah. Um, I'd love to talk about this more. I think we'll move on, but thank you for
Mm-hmm.
asking. It was a really smart question. I feel like I have more things to say about
Yeah, we
who
should look
Muhammad
back to
Seven
it
is.
as the conversation goes on. Let's make an agreement.
Sure, or
We're
another
going to
time.
carry all our important things with us into this conversation.
This is. I've never interviewed a fellow podcaster before, and it's so far it's a really interesting experience. Yeah.
It's weird for me. It's weird. It's rare that I'm like on a podcast and I'm not. I was like looking on my desktop for like where are all of my notes and references and all of my research, and it's
Right.
like, nope,
No.
I'm actually just supposed to show up with myself and that's the research. Whoa.
I love it. So today we're gonna listen to and chat about two songs from your new album.
Hmm.
I have several guesses for why you named the album Halfsies.
Hmm.
I'm prepared for all my guesses to be wrong.
Okay.
Do you want to hear my guesses, or would you like to set the record straight?
I would like to hear your guesses.
Okay, great. So as a fellow mixed race person, I expect part of it has to do with the idea of us being half and half. Is that part of it?
Okay, is that your final guess?
No,
Do you have other guesses?
I
I'd
have.
like to hear all of the guesses and then I will just tell you.
Okay, great, thank you. It it also seems to me that Miss Freedomland, sort of as I tried to articulate before, in some ways is half you and half your mother. And even though the math doesn't work, maybe like I said earlier, half every woman. And it also occurs to me that Miss Freedomland might be half Lizzie, the person, and half Lizzie, the performer. Um, okay, lastly, I'm most familiar with the word halvesies as the idea of us going in on something half and half. Like, hey, I want a sandwich, and you say, want to go halvesies? Um, so I'm curious if there's an element of that in it, and if so, I'm curious what that meant to you. Those are my
Okay,
guesses.
so where it comes from, which is not the same as what it means. Where it comes from is a line in the title track, the first song on the album, that even good love is a one-lane road. It's honor among thieves. Dive in head first, come up for air alone. Should have gone halvesies. Which is like the self-reproach that you do when you've fallen so in love and you've invested a lot of yourself into something or someone. And when the dust settles, you find yourself alone and broken, and you realize maybe I should have held some part of myself back and waited for the other person to contribute more instead of getting wrecked by jumping headfirst into something that was inevitably going to destroy me. So, like, we all know that that's not really possible. Like, when you are sometimes like the wheels get turning and you have to make a leap of faith.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're feeling really broken, there's a lot of like math that you do. Like, well, what if I had held this part back? What if I had been more careful in this way? And then in the rest of the song, I'm kind of reflecting on opposites. objects and their shadows.
Hmm.
You know, the crater and the meteor that made it. The concept of displacement is really important in this album.
Mm-hmm.
As a Black person in America, I know that I'm not supposed to be here. We were picked up from one place and put somewhere else. And that makes a mark.
Mm-hmm.
It leaves a scar on the land and on us as individuals, like through the generations. And we live through so many other instances of that feeling, right? Where like we see a scar or we see a shadow or we see a consequence, and we're trying to work backwards to what was the event? What was the force and the mass that caused the displacement? What was the object that left the empty space somewhere else? I feel that in America, we are living in the empty spaces left by violence.
Yeah.
Patriarchal violence, male violence, homophobic violence, colonial violence, economic violence, the violence of war. And culturally, our response, the assimilation response, is like, let's not talk about that thing that happened before.
Right.
You know, at our best, we're like, let's put a Band-Aid on the wound. Rarely are we willing to ask what caused the wound.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an album that starts in that place of like, if I'm covered in scars, the beginning of freedom is in looking for the source. And then you have to start to like construct something on top of the blank space. Sonically, I was also trying to do that in that song and on the album, really play with negative space, play with that half full, half empty idea. The arrangement that I worked on with producer Graham Richmond for the song Halfsies, and there are elements of it in some of the other songs like Getaway Car, Morning Dove Waltz. I mean, a lot of the songs have this like sometimes uncomfortable moments of empty space. I wanted there to feel like silence and uncomfortable blankness up next to chaos. You hear that in the string arrangement. Suddenly there'll be like this cacophony of strings and percussion, and you're like, you feel like you're surrounded by a windstorm, and then suddenly it drops to silent. That's another representation of these kind of oppositions that I'm trying to deal with all over the record.
Wow, two such powerful ideas. So incredible that going back to the reference to Halfsies, and the title track is Halfsies. Is that the case?
Yes,
that's right. First of all, I couldn't have been more wrong with my guesses.
No, it's okay. But you got there. I feel like you were getting there at the end, so I was like, I'm gonna jump in.
I love it. But how incredibly powerful the notion of the ways, and this, I mean, I feel like this permeates the whole album, the ways that you have given all of yourself and, you know, been made to regret it. And the notion of trying to find in whatever it is a new future where those aren't the conditions, maybe.
Absolutely. Yes. Ooh, I want to write that down. That's a really good blurb. I want to put that sticker on the CD.
Wow.
Yeah.
I
think the other part of it is like, and if we talk about Lagunita, we'll get into this, but, you know, after I wrote and had mostly recorded the album, I received a PTSD diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And it started to fill in a lot of the gaps for me, where my experience of like how my brain works is that in moments of stress, my mind is working a mile a minute and there's chaos and there's a lot of noise and information. And then suddenly I'll hit a wall and it's just blank and I can't remember parts of my life. And I wanted to find a sonic way to represent what it was like to move through the world with the brain that I have, where a lot of times my brain is kind of overworking. And then right up next to that chaos is blanks, where I can't remember traumatic moments, where my memory just like is like, you can't handle this. We're gonna pull the curtain down.
Wow. Once again, the halves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Do I want to ask one more question? I think I'm going to skip some of my. I think we've covered enough of some of what I wanted to ask you. Oh, actually, no. A few more things before we jump into the first
Great.
song. Um, so this is we haven't covered this at all, and it's so kind of interesting and odd that I have to ask you about it. You've said that Halfsies is not just an album, but a video game.
Mm-hmm.
Listeners of the show will know at this point that I belong to a family of gamers, my
Mm-hmm.
wife and son and I. And while I've been experimenting with lo-fi 16-bit video game music under my acoustic tracks, it never occurred to me to make an album that was itself
Mm-hmm.
a video game. I'm very curious about your process and what you think about that.
Okay, so this isn't like a literal video game, right?
Yeah,
When you
yeah,
sit down to put on an album, of course it is sort of a passive experience because you're receiving sound. Um, but when I hear albums that really light me up, I do feel like I am actively in there walking the road of the song. I recently started watching the show based on the book The Three Body Problem.
hmm,
Um, and that story really aligns with how I envision halvesies fitting into people's lives.
hmm,
I want you to feel at the very beginning that you are kind of strapped into a roller coaster seat. Um, you're kind of seeing scenery go by. You're not really able to have much agency over what's happening, but like it's more than just listening to words. You should be having an experience with me. And as the album goes on, I think like you get a little more agency. The songwriting
hmm.
voice shifts a little bit. It starts to be about like, instead of like these things have happened and I'm trying to work it out, to like, where are we headed? Um, there's a little bit more of a sense of strength as the album goes on, and resolve. So it's kind of like this process of like, you have to go through some levels. Not every moment of liberation is fighting the Nazis, who in this album are like, the ghosts and the memories. Like we have these like big enemies
Yeah,
that we want to externally fight.
right.
To get there, we actually have to fight some demons within first.
Hmm.
We have to like feel passive in our experience of the world. We have to look at the landscape changing all around us. We have to start to learn how to, work with our own psyche and then work in community. And then we expand our reach
Mm.
to like maybe migrating, maybe being a part of a large social movement. Like, right, it starts small.
Yep.
You sort of come to terms with what are my tools that I have available to me? What are my capabilities as a player, a character? Who are my allies? Who's an enemy? Who's an ally disguised as an enemy? And the other way around. Like, is this false plank that I step on going to drop me down into further suffering, addiction, conflict? Or is it going to drop me down into the soul place where I'm able to connect with myself, and the spirits who came before? That's what happens in Sleeping in the Next Room. You drop down into the cave of like reflection and nurturance. So there's all different levels and spaces that we're operating on as we try to move towards freedom. And I kind of have synesthesia when it comes to my music. So people can be forgiven for like not totally getting exactly like who are the characters and what are the levels, but like I feel it so clearly that like Lagunita is a song that starts out on, the surface level, the Earth's horizon, and then by the guitar solo, we're very much having like a street race in space.
Mm.
Like clearly we are like racing cars, out in the Milky Way. Some of these songs feel cave-like to me. There are subterranean songs. Like you have to move through so many levels to get to freedom.
Wow.
I have to resist the urge to say, does that make sense at the end of like every explanation of my work? Because like, no, it doesn't make sense, but also it does make a kind of sense. Like the reason I went, like I wanted to build a world, and I actually really still do have some sketches and plans for an actual video game or VR experience that I would love to turn this album into.
Whoa.
Because I just really do have a clear vision of the world that this record lives in. And I think it's useful to think of an album as something that you can participate in rather than something that you're listening to.
Yeah.
Because I do not want to be objectified as the speaker, as the songwriter. I want you to think of yourself as a character in this world rather
Right.
than like, look at her.
Right. That's amazing. It's interesting to me how clearly, this is going to sound strange, but how clearly you understand the work. And I say that because it's interesting to me because, well, because that's not my experience of my work. I make a thing and it takes me forever to figure out what it is.
Mm-hmm. I'm the same way, actually.
Oh, okay.
And the secret here, like I couldn't have told you all that when I put the pen down at the end of writing the final song for this record.
Sure.
Which probably was Shield and Sword, if I remember correctly. It came later, and this album took a really fucking long time to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Can I curse on your show?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I forgot to ask.
No, you're good.
This is like now the like very everyday stuff of making an album. Like when I was working on this album, I didn't have a label. When I first started it, I didn't have a booking agent. I had management, but I ended up eventually signing with new management before it came out. Like so many of the pieces that were to come into place to make sure that this album got the launch that it deserved, like were far distant goals when I started recording it. And so like after the pandemic, there were so many, after like the lockdowns ended, there were so many artists who had finished albums that like, even if you got a record deal, January 1st, 2021, your album wasn't going to come out for many months.
Right.
And that was the case for me. So I actually ended up having a lot of time as I was shopping the album around to try to come up with like a clearer vision of what I had made. And I had a partner who was a creative director and was like a really great interlocutor. Shout out to Cole Nielsen. He did all the visuals for the album that like really reflect this concept of me being like a character in a chaotic kind of magical video game world. And I smoked a lot of weed and like sat with these stories that I had written and sat with the experiences that had created them. And I started to realize that I was trying to write the story of my own liberation. I felt the urgency when I was writing, but I didn't know the full picture yet. I didn't have that bird's eye view.
That's amazing. Thanks for...
So never fear. If you don't know yet, you can get there.
Yeah.
When you're working on something.
I think one of the things I'm taking from what you just said that's instructive is that for us as songwriters to allow a space, in the wake of the work,
yes,
to make space for the work to breathe, for you to breathe, for you to to have a relationship, because it's so easy to keep moving and to write more songs and to do more things.
And that's what you want to do. I like looking back, of course, it feels like everything happened the way that it was meant to happen, but like at the time, I was so frustrated. I was like in the middle of 2021, I was like, I have an almost finished album and I have no plans for release. I was trying to get labels interested. Now looking back, it's like, oh, of course, it was great that you had all that time. And like, I had people in my life saying, be patient. It's going to happen how it's meant to happen. It's going to happen. But it was super frustrating. I was like, why can't I fucking get signed? Like, why can't I get, an advance to like finish up the mix and like get, promotional materials together? Like,
yeah,
a lot of these issues that caused me to delay were like material issues in my working life that I was really frustrated by.
Sure.
But like looking back, it meant that I had time to like have the tough conversations about what are you really trying to say? What are you really trying to get across? What like really is going on here? And to get visuals that like reflected that. Yeah, unfortunately, the boring answer is it does take time. And like I needed to be more healed in my mind and in my spirit, and I needed to do trauma therapy before I was ready to talk about really any of the stories behind these songs, because a lot of them, I really scraped up the darkest moments of my life and put them on display. And I think if I had been able to release this album 2 years ago as I wanted to, I wouldn't have been ready to talk about it. I would have played the songs, and that would have been great. That would have been a different type of experience. It would have been a little bit more private, but I think now I'm actually ready to share some of the stories because I know that there are other people that are experiencing similar things in their own lives.
Yeah. That's so lovely. Well, now we'll play the song of yours that I chose. And you just mentioned it. It is Sleeping in the Next Room.
Ooh, good choice.
You're sleeping in the next room. The moon's a hollow shell. No one here to talk to. I'm talking to myself. And I'm afraid to tell you I'm not who I was. You're sleeping in the next room. I'm falling out of love. I'm falling out of love. Yellow tile in the little kitchen. When we moved in, barely room there for my queen bed. Didn't notice the canyon yawning in between us. Now you're sleeping in the next room. The moon's a hollow shell. No one here to talk to. I'm talking to myself. And I'm afraid to tell you I'm not who I was. You're sleeping in the next room. I'm falling out of love. I'm falling out of love. Wrung my white dress, hung it out to dry on the clothesline. But the frost crept in, froze it solid till it fell and shattered into pieces overnight. And now you're sleeping in the next room. The moon's a hollow shell. No one here to talk to. I'm talking to myself. And I'm afraid to tell you I'm not who I was. You're sleeping in the next room. I'm falling out of love. I'm falling out of love. Falling out of love.
Whoa, what a listening experience. It's not often that I'll like sit down and listen to something that I've already released. That was really kind of a trip.
Normally I would count us back in from listening, but it's okay because I want to keep what you just said. So
Okay.
it's going to be my first hard start that I've ever done in the podcast. That's so fun to hear. Anything else to say about that? About listening to it freshly?
Man, it made me feel really proud of what we made. And actually, since this song was released, I have performed it approximately 8 quadrillion times on stage. And a song necessarily evolves as you perform it. Like I think of songs as living documents because you record them as they are when you're in the studio, and then the song does become different over time. So it's really nice to actually come back and hear what this text is
Right.
on the record. You know what I mean?
That's so interesting. I never thought about this way, but what you just said made me think when we write a song, I talk about the kernel, like it comes from a kernel of some kind, some spark of inspiration.
Right.
It never occurred to me that that the cycle works this way, that you write the song from the kernel becomes a song, you record the song, and then oddly, the recording is a new kernel. And then you develop that song in the world, but but now we've kind of gone back to the kernel here of the recording.
And like I think so for me there's like other forms. Like there's the kernel, which is the inspiration. Then there's like the platonic song in your mind, like the arrangement that you hear when you hear the song in your head.
Before you record it?
Before you record it, and sometimes during even.
Sure.
Like, and you'll never get there. And I think that's usually a good thing. Because usually what you imagine isn't as good as what real live musicians will play. But like in a way, the recording becomes something of a new platonic ideal. And often like audiences think of that as the song. But I think of the song, like I think the song is like what I just played on stage. Like for me, that's the definitive version. But for audiences, it's usually like what they heard on the record. Which is why I think it's so fun when live albums become, like if you put out a live album and people get really attached to a certain live version.
Right.
That's got to be such a trip. Like think about Fleetwood Mac, like think about Landslide and like how they wrote that song and they put it on a record. And the version that a lot of people love the most is that live version.
Right.
People have memories of like breaths they took on a particular stage on a particular day that for them weren't necessarily definitive, but like for millions of people have become definitive. Okay, sorry, I could go on about this all day.
It's really interesting.
I love talking about songwriting. I'm so happy to be on this podcast.
Yay. You've said that Lagunita and Annie Oakley, both tracks on this album, are about having to fight for your life as a tender human being. And I also hear that thread in this song, which is a song about change. You said in your chat with Cindy, I wanted this song to feel like it was a safe place for me to admit that I was changing in ways that might be inconvenient for other people, particularly men. You also talked about this song taking place in the underwater cave, a location that appears several times on this record and seems to represent a safe place to be your authentic self, maybe to take shelter from the storm. I don't think you actually mention the underwater cave, well, not in this song anyway. So I only know that it's an important idea from your conversation with Cindy, and I'm curious where that comes from and why it matters to you so much.
It's funny that you point that out because sometimes I forget. I don't know if you know the artist, The Hawk in the Nest. No. We were talking, he's a really cool folk artist out of New England. And we were on Instagram talking about a song. And I was like, oh, isn't this vocal so great? It's like, it's a bronze vocal. And he was like, what do you mean by that? And I was like, like close your eyes, picture the metal bronze, like the warm color of the metal, the resonance, like that's what this vocal is. And he was like, Lizzie, not everybody has synesthesia. You actually have to like tell people what you mean. I have that experience a lot with my music because I'm like, well, of course, everyone can see that this song takes place in a cave, and the background vocals are the harmonics of mermaids singing, which represent the force of like women ancestors and like basically the Greek chorus that every woman needs in her life to go on with the difficult work of living under patriarchy. Like, okay, I need to elaborate a little bit. Yeah. For me, in every moment of my life, every moment of transition, every moment of digging in and putting in the work, every moment of like hustle, there have been these moments of retreat to enclosed spaces with other women, femme people, queer people, where we gather and we share information, and it's okay to say the worst possible thing on your mind. And that's the sensation that I wanted to create in this song. It's also in the Heartbreak Store. I feel like any feminine person knows this feeling of like the world is all storm and conflict outside, but we can close the kitchen door and have a cup of tea and really talk about it. And it's safe in here. And then you kind of compose yourself to go back out into the world. It's like an unmasked place. And I am a Scorpio. I'm a water sign. I take caves very seriously. The subterranean spaces where the dirt is cool, and you haven't put on the mask and the artifice of like presenting yourself to anyone else. That's a really important place to go back to check in with who you really are.
Yeah.
I talked about that in my, I wrote about that in my previous album, Vanity, the song Loyalty. It's like, I earn my living in a lower plane, shoveling dirt into the mouth of the cave. I'm always kind of like returning to the cave place because to me, that's the art. That's the place where art comes from. And it's also the place where like your vision for your life can really be like defined.
This is all making me think of the book Circe by Madeline Miller. Are you a fan?
Oh my God. I love that book.
Oh, I love that book.
I love that book. Of course you're into Circe. Okay, yes. We are on the same page. Yeah, and Kate Victor and Sadie Dupuis, the vocalists on this song, really like got that feeling of like, we're basically like the Greek chorus of like the girlies saying like, let it out. You can say the hard thing.
Right.
We got you.
Right. Yeah. You three have captured that just emotionally. In fact, it was the next thing I was going to comment on was between is it Harp that you're starting? I'm assuming that's you on the harp.
The harp. I wrote the song on harp. And we basically kept the harp part intact from what I would play as a solo artist. And then Graham Richmond, the producer, built this arrangement of kind of interlocking, but not quite matching bass and percussion parts.
Yeah, it's weird
like
and cool.
Rhythmically, like it's kind of hard to play the song with a band. Like you have to, because my timing is not necessarily how another musician would count the song. For me, there's like harp and breath timing, which is like its own math. And then how a bassist would choose to play is like a little bit different. So I thought that was really fun, that the arrangement kind of evens out to being like a clock. Like each little wheel is spinning on its own timer. Yeah. But they all end up in the same place.
As a listener, you really get that even if you don't understand it. It's off kilter in this really cool way.
Thank you. I love when that happens. Like that's why I feel like that's why people love jazz, like watching jazz live. Like you're seeing people play kind of different and at times opposing and at times intersecting parts. And it's the moments where they intersect that are so revelatory.
Yep. I love a bunch of different things about this song. I want to start with the chorus. I like the structure of how you have basically 2 short verses with 3 sprawling choruses. You talked about how you've abandoned usual song structure on this record to mimic. It's a roller coaster. It has abrupt stops. It has unexpected chaos. I like how the choruses outnumber the verses and kind of own the song, especially since both the song and the chorus are so unapologetic. The chorus says, I am right now falling out of love with you because I'm growing out of this relationship. In a sense, I'm not just leaving you, I'm leaving you behind. And I can't quite place in some ways what kind of song this is. It's not a love song in a traditional sense, although it might be a love song to yourself. It's not a torch song. It's not exactly a diss track.
No.
There's a tension between the liberation element of the song and the quiet conflict of leaving someone who doesn't yet know they're being left. What did it feel like to write about something so fraught?
Yeah, your analysis is right on. The quiet conflict was the central thing for me. What's interesting is that like this song started in like a real moment of my life, but it's also fictionalized. Like I think a lot of songwriters can relate to that. That original kernel, like you mentioned, the inspiration for the song is like, this is a real experience I'm having, but then I kind of zoomed out. So the chorus literally is something I wrote at the kitchen table, at the end of a relationship. And that's a horrible, horrible feeling to have. Someone I love is sleeping in the next room. I'm sitting here contemplating my getaway. What an awful feeling to have. And it's funny because I'm sitting in my new kitchen. I'm living alone for the first time. And living alone has, like, for me, shed a lot of light on, like, my past songwriting and the spaces in which I've written in the past. There's something really fraught about writing songs with other people at home. Because you're necessarily
Totally
demanding and defining a solitary space when you're supposed to be part of a family or a partnership or whatever it might be. And I think what's tough about this song and what I'm kind of trying to get at is that I think there is this particular experience for women where when we're at home with our families, we are supposed to be nurturing. We are supposed to be for others. But if you're a songwriter, your home needs to be the place where you write.
Mm-hmm.
And your home needs to be the place where your mind can be expansive and brutal and difficult and free.
Yes.
And those two roles don't really fit.
Wow.
So like living alone can be, I mean, for me, it's been really fantastic as like a writer move. So that's like where that chorus came from, literally sitting, like I'm sitting alone in the kitchen, looking at the moon and then thinking about what's next. And also really struggling with this concept of like, I'm going to do the thing that hurts somebody. And then in the verses, I'm kind of flashing back to like, here's where it started. It started somewhere. So it's like, I pictured that like really sweet scene in a movie where a couple moves in and they're like, oh, look at the yellow tiles. And,
right.
you know, how are we going to fit our stuff into this apartment? And, you know, then little by little, the images get more and more heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And there's more dividing, you know, there's the canyon yawning between us. There's,
right.
you know, the white dress that breaks into a million pieces. You know, the really sweet domestic images kind of turn into images of fracture.
Right.
I don't remember what your question was, but that's how the song got written.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered my question, or in fact, I think you've answered my following two questions, because the next things I was going to comment on were how much I like those two verses, and in particular, right, that line of the canyon yawning between us is gorgeous. It's
Oh, thank you.
also sad, and then the metaphor of the white dress that freezes and shatters, which I heard it through the sort of the lens of the white wedding dress, just because that's the sort of metaphor that I'm most familiar with, which represents all of these, right, sexist conventions ultimately. And
yeah, like I hung it up to clean it, and overnight, in came the weather and it broke and fell on the ground.
Right. Yeah. So powerful. But I guess the original question was, what was it? The song is, it's there's a balance, back to Halfsies. There's a balance in the song between the liberation element of you taking your life in your own hands, taking your life back, finding the path where maybe you had lost it. But also, and it was interesting to hear you say, what a horror, because it felt horrible to me. It's sort of a cheerful song, ultimately.
Yes.
I think the liberation, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, the feeling of freedom carries it, I think, and makes it feels hopeful, ultimately.
That's good to hear, because that's how I always feel. Even like the darkest song, in singing it, you are asserting yourself. So that's a good thing.
Absolutely. But I wondered if, it's interesting, I wondered if for you it also felt the way it felt for me, which was just the heartbreak of it really also rang true of somebody that you clearly care about so much. And, but it's complicated. So anyway, it was interesting to hear.
It's complicated.
Yeah. I like the way
it really is complicated, and it can be hard to sing. This is a song that like as I've toured these songs since the record came out, like this is one of the songs that a lot of like women will come up to me after the show and say like, that one really stuck with me. And that's how I know that I was writing from the true place.
Oh, that's cool. I like that barometer.
Yes. If the girlies like it, We did something right.
I think that should be a t-shirt.
Yes. I also always say, if the hoes don't trust you, neither do I. Neither do I.
Also fantastic. You should just keep going, because one after the other, you've got amazing.
We're going to get more radical as time goes on.
All right. Well, in that case, let's move on to your chosen song. So you actually offered two different songs.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, I didn't understand the format of the podcast, so yes, I did offer a backup.
It's true. It's actually not uncommon. Oftentimes, people will send me two or a few songs, and so the first was Lagunitas, which I love, but in the end chose Babylon.
Great.
Here's Babylon by my guest Lizzie No from their latest album, Halfsies.
Oh, I sat down by the river, beside the one I love. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. Oh, in the midst thereof. We wept when we remembered the place where we came from. Our voices could not rise up singing down in Babylon. Oh, down in Babylon. There were thieves and killers marching through the middle of the town. We knelt and prayed by the unmarked grave where better men lay down, where better men lay down. My love said, I'm no father, call me no man's son, but take my hand, we'll go together up from Babylon, oh, up from Babylon. We drove out through the desert, some white painted red. We sheltered in some stranger's cave, and not a word we said, no, not a word we said. The devil stood behind us, the deep blue sea beyond. So we pressed the gas and we didn't look back to glance at Babylon, no, to glance at Babylon. Born on salty water, babies sing new songs. They feel no shame and they fear no pain. Away from Babylon, oh, away from Babylon.
And once again, that was Babylon from my guest Lizzie No's latest album, Halfsies. I love getting to listen. So it's like I've listened to that song many times, and it's fun getting to do it live here with you. I always hear something. It sort of pulls the layers apart somehow to do it in this context for me. And this time, the thing that I noticed was production related. The strings and that sort of jazzy guitar that just never stops. It's so fast and lovely. And
Graham Richmond, shout out to Graham, who, wrote such a beautiful arrangement for this tune, wrote those string arrangements. I have had a musical crush on the Attica Quartet for years, and we got several of the members of the quartet to come and play on this record, and it elevates it beyond. Especially on this song, because, when I really wrote the song, I thought it was going to turn out a little bit more lively and bluegrassy. And that would have been a cool recording, and we do that sometimes on stage, but I think that Graham's really spare, kind of jazzy, reflective arrangement really works, especially as the album closer. So it kind of came out unexpectedly, which I love.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Between your gorgeous singing and guitar playing already has a vibe, and it's such an interesting kind of counterpoint. The
Thank you.
Really lovely.
I can't remember if I played the acoustic on this song or if Graham did all the guitars.
Oh, got it.
You hear a door opening at the beginning, which whenever we're hearing those like background sounds, there are a couple of songs where we kept the demo. We kept an element of the demo, whether it was my vocal or my acoustic or my harp. And this was one of them. I can't remember if it was my vocal part or my guitar. But I always love hearing those sounds because it reminds me of the early days when we were like just starting to record. I think we recorded my demo of this in Graham's apartment on the Lower East Side. And you're hearing like street noise and doors opening and closing and stuff.
So impressive to me when an artist uses their demo as the final track on a thing. It's like
incredible.
Incredible.
Thank you. You know what? I never will use like a whole one, but I always like to include something on, like it's kind of like a wedding. I don't know if I'll ever get married, but you're supposed to have something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue.
Yeah.
For me, every album has to have something that was like on the demo, something that was recorded live with, voice and instrument. Like there has to be something like that.
Never heard that idea before, and I love it so much. So I really like when an artist uses an idea that's familiar and well-trodden as Babylon, but dares to take a fresh shot at it and make it their own.
Thank you.
I think it takes a lot of guts. And so, Babylon is a key theme in reggae music. It's a sort of a way to talk about the evils of the modern world. It contrasts to the Rastafarian idea of Zion, which refers literally to Jerusalem and is a metaphor for freedom and homeland, among other things. Babylon and Zion are also very literally tell the story of slavery in the Middle Passage. And your song Babylon seems to have been inspired, it was my guess, by the most famous song I know about Babylon, which is By the Rivers of Babylon, written by the Jamaican reggae group The Melodians in 1970, and has since been covered hundreds of times across genres. As a child, the version I knew of it was the one by Don McLean. Rivers of Babylon breaks my heart every time I hear it. When the wicked carried us away in captivity, required of us a song. Now how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land is such a powerful liberation statement.
Yes.
But the hopeful moment for me in that song is the end of the first verse, which is, By the Rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. Yet we wept to remember Zion. It's the remembering that feels hopeful to me. The insistence of an oppressed people, we will not forget who we are. I've heard you say, my people were brought here against our will, and our history was forcibly erased, which is a really cosmically violent experience to have. Which I thought was an incredible thing to say about it. Am I right that your song, Babylon, is sort of a conversation with By the Rivers of Babylon and, in a way with all Black people?
Thank you for that, incredible introduction. Yes to everything. What's interesting is that I was raised in the church, kind of a Baptist evangelical hybrid background, and in Catholic school, and I sang in choir. And my first interaction with this story was from the Old Testament, from Psalms. And we had a song in choir that was not the reggae version. It was By the Rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. We wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof.
I love that you sang that.
And as a child harpist, that really grabbed me. I mean, I was a little kid when I heard and sang this, and thinking about a people that had been taken from their homeland to somewhere new, and then being required to entertain. And in their moment of mourning, they hung their harps up on the trees. They weren't playing anymore. They were sitting and reflecting and remembering who they had used to be and where they came from.
Yeah.
So obviously, it was very potent for me as a kid, just reading about it in the Bible and knowing the story as it's written in the Old Testament. Right. So then when I got older and I kind of came more to consciousness as a Black person and learning about how the Black tradition intersects with the Old Testament, it felt like this story was a really useful tool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the background. The other thing that's very personal for me is that the reason that this song is the last one on the album is it deals with the future. When you are someone who's in America because your ancestors were kidnapped and marriage was not available to enslaved people, marriage is still not really a model that supports Black families.
Mm-hmm.
The nuclear family is really tricky in our community, and like it's a very capitalist, divisive model, right?
Right.
The idea of family and bringing children into the world and keeping our families together is something that has always been a central question in the Black American experience. I was in my late 20s. I was dating someone. I was thinking about, would I want to have children? And there are so many things in our culture that tell Black women, we get a lot of mixed messages, right? Like, you're only valuable if you're a mother, but Black mothers aren't valued and
right.
Black children aren't protected. And we're being cut down left and right by the healthcare gaps, by police violence, by the racism that puts environmental like toxins like in our communities. There are so many things telling Black parents your children are up for consumption by the machine. And I think that the way to know if a revolution has been successful is that Black children will be growing up in peace, and they're not going to be having these same feelings of shame and being contained. Like, they're going to be free. Our kids are going to be free. So that's why I wanted to end the album with this song. And I'm tearing up because I'm thinking about my baby nephew, and I'm thinking about my friends that are, I think it's such a revolutionary act to raise a Black child in optimism and in hope and in freedom and in curiosity and in song. So I was trying to capture that seed and that kernel of hope that we are going to have a day where we're not fighting for our kids anymore, where our kids take for granted that they are free, and we can teach them about the past from a different place. We're not going to be in this place forever. We're not going to be in this place of conflict. We're going to be in a new place where they have a new reality.
That is so incredible, and you are incredible. And I really, just to take something from what you just said, I take so many things from what you just said, but I love the idea. I'll rephrase it, and you can tell me if this is right or not.
Sure.
I love the idea that it will not always be about struggle. Like the point is not actually the struggle of liberation. The point of liberation and our liberation and Black liberation is to arrive at a place where the oppression is no longer happening.
Yes, that's actually the key.
Wow.
I think that we are in a place. Okay, I'm going to get real for a second.
Please.
This song is not intended as a call out, but let it be a call out to white people who call themselves less leftists, who do not embody revolutionary hope. I have some friends and allies who I've really gotten into conflict with because although we believe the same things about why the world is the way that it is right now, and who the villains are, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and so on, I feel like my guiding principle is revolutionary hope. It's a vision of what the future must be like. It's a vision of us being healthy. It's a vision of us being free. It's a vision of us having rest. It's a vision of having a lot of choices about how we want to live our lives. And I've noticed that a lot of white leftists lately are well, we're pretty much just fucked because of all of these reasons. And the reasons that they're listing are correct, but the nihilism behind it is, in fact, getting in our way. And if we don't have a movement that sees a beautiful vision of what's to come, we're just going to be obsessed and addicted to fighting and struggling even within our own communities. So if we don't have a clear vision of where we're going, what are we doing? And I have found that, like, the more you spend time with Black revolutionaries, the more you realize, like, it's supposed to feel good. It's supposed to be fun. Even in struggle, we have to have fun. We have to have music. If it's just doom and gloom, it's not the revolution.
Yeah. I was just shouting out on a previous episode, Adrienne Marie Brown and her pleasure activism, which is which I feel like, yeah, I have so much to learn about this in spite of sort of having spent my life trying to get good at it. I feel like it's such a challenge. Yeah.
Because I think the other thing about Babylon is it's a reminder that whether it's like Black people in America, we have only existed here under conditions of violence. There has never been a time when Black people have been in America where we have been free or really fully been citizens.
Right.
Okay, but where does that leave us? Look at all that we've done. Look at all that we do every single day, even under these conditions. And I'm sure the same was true when we were enslaved. People were still finding a way to have genuine connections with each other, genuine connections with the earth, real joy, real optimism, even amidst all the hopelessness. So, like, we don't get to say it's too hopeless now. If my enslaved ancestors made it enough to raise children, made it enough to, like, provide some seed of hope for the next generation, I have no excuse. That's the wisdom that I think we uniquely as a community have to offer, which is that we have always been in these conditions since we've been here. And there was a place before where, like, we weren't enslaved. So it's like, it's good to remember, like, it wasn't always this way.
Right.
But it's been this way for a long time and we've carried on, Anyway.
Everything.
I can't believe it's before noon and we're talking about the spiritual origins of the revolution. I love to see it.
I feel like that's probably a relatively normal occurrence in both your house and my house.
Yes.
As it should be.
Over coffee, we get free.
I love it. Almost everything you say makes me cry, which is one of my barometers for truth.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So,
can I say one more little thing about this song?
Yes. I mean,
that I haven't totally thought through.
Sure.
I have set this album up for a sequel just because the last line is, like, about how babies sing new songs.
Yeah.
It asks a question that I'm not ready to answer yet, which is, what song would a completely free person sing who has never known captivity?
Oh my God.
I'd love to hear it, and maybe someday I'll write it. Maybe it's not mine to write, but that's the next half.
I mean, that is just incredible.
I hope it can come to pass. That's why I'm saying it into the microphone. It feels impossible now, but I think that's the goal, right? I want to know what it sounds like.
I do too. I do too, and I would like to hear it from you.
Okay. I'll do it.
I mean, there's no reason we can't hear it from many of us. But you, I want to hear it from you. That was my last question about this song. I had a few other sort of questions about verses that I think I'm going to skip over, just because you have taken it to such a profound level. I think I can't go back into
thank you.
little specifics. But my last question was about, in your conversation with Cindy, you talked about, that Miss Freedomland is making this choice to step onto the boat to the next place, mm-hmm. and I think you've already spoken on, on the importance. Actually, I can't remember your words, and so I'm actually not going to try and paraphrase. But
it's okay.
But the goal you've talked about, sort of the goal of liberation, and it feels like that's what is happening here in this last song. It's moving on to a new place, and then
it's a little bit reckless. Like, who wants to? It's kind of a Thelma and Louise moment. But
I can't believe it.
it's on.
I can't believe it. That was my other comment. Was about Thelma and Louise. So many of these questions I had for you, I put a lot of thought into these things. I was like, oh, these are smart questions. You've just come out with the answers before I've even answered. Okay,
that means you really listened closely and you get it.
I hope so. I was going to ask about Thelma and Louise because I recently rewatched it, which, by the way,
it's such a wild and good movie.
it is so fucking good. And it holds, I mean, the dozen times I've seen it since 1991, a masterpiece every time.
Yes, it holds up.
It holds up. And I couldn't help but wonder in the 6th verse if that was inspired by the climax of the film.
It is.
So I'll read the verse. Then the devil stood behind us, the deep blue sea beyond. So we pressed the gas and we didn't look back to glance at Babylon. It is.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It is. And that's like the car that we were racing in space in Lagunitas is also the car that we're going to, like, some of the stuff that we use in our struggle, we can recycle into the place of our freedom, you know? Like the vehicle of your freedom is something that you build in struggle and in reflection is something that I feel very strongly. Like you don't want to get to the moment of choice and not have built up your tools.
Wow.
Like the car matters to me, if that makes sense.
This is like, I'm going to be thinking about this for months, I think. So please continue. Say more.
I just feel that the song is also kind of a roadmap for if I had to try to teach somebody how to get free, right? Like, what do I know? But I know what I know. And I know that you need to sit down by the water, feel all of the feelings, let in the grief, let in who you used to be and who got lost and who got left behind. You need to look around and see who are the martyrs, right? The unmarked graves where better men lay down. Like, we don't really even know how many of our ancestors were destroyed by the state.
Right.
And destroyed by capitalism and destroyed by the Middle Passage. Like, we don't even know everybody's name. We need to identify that and make a space for that. Then we need to actually make the decision to make a change. Sometimes you're going to need to shelter in a stranger's cave. You're going to need to be arm in arm with someone you don't know and maybe don't think you have something in common with. And not a word will be said, meaning your shared language will just be action and experience and your shared goal, right? Like that's going to be a step. Each of these steps is going to feel terrifying. The last step is going to be actually like choosing to leave the place of captivity behind. Like you're going to feel like you're driving off a cliff into the unknown. And actually a lot of people don't want to do that. James Baldwin talked about that, how a lot of people, no one really ever wanted to be free. It's not comfortable.
Sure.
We've gotten very used to our cages. We've gotten very used to, I'm sure each and every one of your listeners is going to have an experience of this, of like, well, in theory, I'm against patriarchy, but there are some things that actually are really comfortable for me about it.
Right.
Or like, I'm against colorism, but it kind of benefits me sometimes, and it's going to be kind of hard to deconstruct that, right? Like, we actually have to leave it behind.
Right.
We have to deconstruct that stuff to move into the next thing.
But I think part of what you're saying is we can get attached to the ways that we're benefiting from being on the oppressor end, but we also get addicted to our identity as oppressed people. Right.
Exactly.
And so what's so incredible, I forget exactly how you just said it, but how scary it is to leave even that part behind, even the chains behind. Oh, that's so powerful.
I think this is like, it's being a diasporic people means like we are defined by what we left behind. Mm-hmm. And so our place of reflection is at the river, and then our freedom needs to be like maybe at the ocean. I think there's like there's so much literature and like archaeological evidence about enslaved people who chose the ocean instead of oppression, instead of slavery. They chose that. And symbolically, that's going to be what it takes. We're going to have to like face down real existential questions and blankness and uncertainty to get free.
I used to have a segment that I if I was talking to a radical songwriter, I'd place at the end. I called Liberation Toolkit, and
Yes.
similar to how
That's what I'm trying to do.
you've done it with this record, clearly. I mean, and it also
Well,
seems
that's why I
like
call it a video game, because I want you to walk with me
Right.
into the unknown.
yeah, it's so cool to see. I mean, it really seems like this is just the way you live your life. Like to be around you seems to be in the video game, learning from your
Oh,
example.
thank you for saying that. That's a compliment. I'm working on it. I really am working on being aligned at all times with my higher self and like with other revolutionaries, like in particular, like Black feminist revolutionaries.
So I had to stop having that segment, Liberation Toolkit, because I realized that when I talk to radical songwriters, it's not, you can't compartmentalize it. It's,
Yeah.
you know, and you have been an incredible example of that in this episode. This has
thank you.
this has been an amazing conversation for me. Thank you so much, Lizzie.
Me too. It really means a lot to be able to talk about the radical roots of the songs. There isn't often a space for that in the media that surrounds us. Like even folks that like love the songs and love the music, like there's a political and spiritual element to this for me, and it's really nice to have a space to open up about that.
Well, to finish out the show, we'll each share one cool thing, something that's piqued your interest or even something you've been mildly obsessed with that you think our listeners might enjoy. Would you like to go first, or do you want me to?
Can you go first?
Yes. Mine is a novel from 2023 called Yellowface by Rebecca Kwong. At face value, it's a book about racism in the book publishing industry. And at first, it seemed very cynical to me, which is not my favorite thing. It was one of those books that I liked but didn't love, but somehow got me thinking in new and interesting ways that aren't always possible in a book that feels easy. Ultimately, I liked how it investigated how imperfect each of us is, how we all make mistakes, sometimes huge mistakes, but that we're also playing a game no one can win. So yes, the mistakes are our own, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. She let each character be both the hero of their own story and the villain of someone else's, and I found that compelling.
Did you choose that special thing before we had this conversation? Because it feels like such a beautiful tie-in to everything that we're talking about.
I did, and I think that's part of how I am living what we're talking about in a different way.
You are good at this. Okay. What I'm obsessed with is mifepristone and misoprostol, which is the combination of medications that make up the abortion pill, aka Plan C. It is an incredible drug. It is so safe. It is safer than an Advil, some scientists have said, and it is available by mail in all 50 states, which means that even if you live in a state with an abortion ban, you can get access to a safe at-home abortion pill where you can manage your own experience with the abortion. So you can get it at plancpills.org. They will give you information about where to get this. I think it's something that every single person of every gender needs to know about right now in America. That like, even as the right wing puts up barriers to our reproductive freedom and Democrats aid and abet them in order to fundraise, there is a medication available all over the country that can help you end a pregnancy privately and safely in your own home.
I did not know that. And
isn't that a cool fun fact? plancpills.org is where you can find out how to get it no matter where you are in the country.
Great. How incredibly important.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Lizzie. Well, Lizzie No, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mohammed 7. I love your stage name, by the way. We talked about this at the beginning. It's a sick performer name.
Thank you. Lizzie, where can people find you online, and what else would you like to plug?
So people can find my music and tour dates and merchandise. I have really cute merchandise, and I have 3 albums available. LizzieNo.com. That's LizzieNo.com. And I'm on tour constantly, so please go to my website and find out where you can see me. I also co-host the Basic Folk podcast on the Bluegrass Situation Podcast Network. We have a lot of really good interviews. I just interviewed Lisa Loeb for the pod, and that's going to be a really good conversation. And if people want to learn more about what we're doing to ensure reproductive rights and reproductive justice here in Tennessee, please go to abortioncaretn.org to find out more and make a donation if you can. That's Abortion Care Tennessee, is the abortion fund that I am on the board of, and I'm so proud to work with them.
Wonderful. Well, I am Muhammad Seven. You can find me at muhammad7.com. It's MUHAMMAD and SEVEN like the number. There you can find my music and tour dates, as well as how to get in touch if you're interested in songwriting, coaching, or lessons. Again, you can become a patron via the link in the show notes or by searching for Muhammad7 on patreon.com. You can find Lizzie No's Patreon. I'll plug it since she forgot to mention it. I'll put that in the show notes as well. If you'd like to ask a question about songwriting and have my guest and I answer on the show, you can send those to me via social media message or by email. Check the link tree for those places, which you can find in the show notes. Many thanks to regular listener Sandy Goodnight for this review titled Listening is Believing. I've listened to a lot of good songwriting podcasts, but this one is brilliant and fresh on multiple levels. Check out the first 15 minutes of the brand new episode with the legend Kendall Winter. That's my previous episode that dropped today, and you'll know what I mean. Well, thanks, Sandy Goodnight, for listening and being part of our community. Glad to have you. I'll leave you today with this quote from Mary Gaucher's wonderful new book, Saved by a Song, The Art and Healing Power of Songwriting. Mary writes, "When a songwriter writes what they care about, what truly matters to them, then boils down each line to its essence, the song becomes a snapshot of their soul. These snapshots are infectious. They go out into the world and become part of the experience of other living souls." All right, folks. See you back here next time on We Flew Off the Page.